finds its way into having an alternate meaning or definition. According to the American Anthropologist, Volume 6, that was published in October of 1893, when talking about polysynthesis in English languages, the writer stated, quote, "I know by experience how difficult it is for a missionary to convey to the minds of his hearers certain religious ideas. Again and again did I try, when missionary to the Ponca Indians, to find the proper Indian word for kingdom in order to make an even approximate translation of the petition, 'Thy kingdom come.' Anyone who has lived amongst Indians know the worthlessness of adducing modern names, i.e., names of objects introduced among the Indians since the arrival of the white race on this continent, for the purpose of illustrating the construct of an Indian language," end quote. It was also well known by these anthropologists that I mentioned earlier, and even the ones that were in between, that by reducing the amount of words to one's vocabulary will cause a chain reaction that would in turn reduce the amount of ideas one may be able to produce, creating a generalized dumbing down effect on the population, and especially on the students that received this type of education. For example, an American anthropologist and one of the direct students of the famous German descent American anthropologist named Melville Herskovitz, a name that you may recall me mentioning on numerous occasions, along with presenting his story to everyone in my previous documentaries, by the name of Margaret Mead, speaks about this during an interview on Social Anthropology, American Character, and Primitive Studies that was conducted and produced by Howard Langer in 1959. During this interview with Margaret Mead, she stated that the usage and learning a different language other than the trade language of English is suppressed, and that this is taught to our children at a young age by the systematic usage of polysynthesis. She also shared a very essential example on how it is all done.
We train people not to be able to learn foreign languages in the most fantastic way, because what we teach a child is, you see, if you take this pencil here, we teach a child this is a pencil. Now this isn't a pencil. This is an object made of wood and lead, designed for writing, which we call a pencil, and other people call it other things, and other people call it other things, and other people call it other things, and other people call it other things.
So, this type of so-called education United States, the transition from the indigenous languages that were once spoken to the English language was a systematic effort brought about to ensure business efficiency and that the trade ran more smoothly. On March 3rd, 1819, Congress passed an act making provision for the civilization of the Indian tribes adjoining the frontier settlements. It is very important to note that the word frontier is, quote, the border or confine of a country that is furthest advanced with a part that fronts an enemy or which an invading enemy meets at front, end quote. This act of 1819 states, quote, that for the purpose of providing against the further decline and final extinction of the Indian tribes, adjoining the frontier settlements of the United States, and for introducing among them the habits and arts of civilization, the President of the United States shall be, and he is hereby authorized in every case where he shall judge improvement in the inhabitants and condition of such Indians practicable, and that the means of instruction can be introduced with their own consent to employ capable persons of good moral character to instruct them in the mode of agriculture suited to their situation, and for teaching their children in reading, writing, and arithmetic, and performing such other duties as may be enjoined, according to such instructions and rules as the president may give and prescribe for the regulation of their conduct in the discharge of their duties. End quote. Those indigenous families that accepted education and employment did so under the guise of civilization. So, where did this idea come from? Well, it could have came in response to the pleas of President Jefferson to the American Indian chiefs upon this land. According to the address made to Indian chiefs by Thomas Jefferson during the early 1800s, pleas were made for the tribes to go into business of trade and industry with the incoming foreigners, stating that those who accepted employment as, quote, cultivators of the earth for the maintenance of their families, those people would be supporting their families better and with less labor. They were assured that by raising stock and bread and by spinning and weaving clothes than by hunting, that more provisions will be provided, and that a woman will clothe more by spinning and weaving than a man by hunting, end quote. Thomas Jefferson also stated that, quote, compared with you, we are but as of yesterday in this land, yet see how much more we have multiplied by industry and the exercise of that reason which you possess in common with us. Follow then our example, brethren, and we will aid you with great pleasure, end quote. So, by sending our children to school and preparing them for the workforce and capitalism and industry, it was thought that we would somehow be excelling to a greater level in life. But this was actually the beginning of slavery here in America for those who were not yet prisoners of war. And we cannot get to this point without adopting a common language that was familiar and foreign at the same time, or so we thought, because there was in fact a universal language of trade already in use. Before interpreters and before foreigners could fully understand the indigenous language upon this land, and before the mixture of German and Indian languages that created English, what was used amongst our ancestors to communicate with incoming foreigners that were arriving upon these lands? The universal language available that was used to conduct trade in America amongst the Indians and foreigners during that time is the same language that is used with babies and young children before they could speak the language of adults. It's the same language used in sports amongst referees and umpires. It is the same language used between a baseball pitcher and a baseball catcher. It's the same language used in secret organizations and amongst law enforcement officials. It is the very same language that you would use if you were somewhere that you could not speak, the language that was commonly understood. This language is known universally as sign language. And according to the handbook of the church's missions to the Indians, and to that the post office of Harvard, Connecticut in 1854, but published in March of 1913, quote, Sign language was of extensive development and existed all over the world and bore a resemblance to the sign language now used in some of our deaf-mute schools. Picture writing the world over probably grew out of sign language, the first stage in development. The second was pictographs, and the third, alphabet. These merge into each other by a slow and gradual process. End quote. It is unfortunate that the sign language is the common language of mainly the deaf and the mute today, and that is no longer widely understood as it was before, when it was used widely amongst those who conducted trade upon these lands. It too is one of the Indian languages that is now in danger of becoming extinct. And some may say for a very good reason, because it has been said that written language and spoken language was developed to hide one's true intent. And when we are focused so much on what is being said or what was written, we just might miss the signs. OCO, my brothers and sisters, relatives, spiritual warriors, and free thinkers. In this segment, I will be covering some essential information concerning the term Moor and what it actually meant historically and now modernly. This was a highly favored request from our viewers, and apparently there is a lot of confusion that needed to be sorted out here. Those of you who in fact follow some of the religious beliefs of what I'm about to go over would not need to cover up your ears at any time during this video. This presentation is strictly served for educational purposes only, and just like all of my previous documentaries, or even those that I will soon release here, the information will not carry any biased formatted beliefs, guesses, assumptions, or opinions in any sense. So, with all of that being said, let's begin this segment with covering the biggest elephant in the room, and that is, are the people of color that resides in America today descendants of the people that were once described as Moors? Now, the answer to this question depends on which of the two very important key factors in regards to this question that an individual subscribes to. These two factors are based upon what an individual believes by way of their personal faith in various religious doctrines, or what an individual knows by way of what they could actually prove realistically. And here's what I mean by that. According to the 1828 Webster's English Language Dictionary, it defines the word belief as, quote, a persuasion of the truth, further stating that belief is, quote, a word that is used for persuasion or opinion when the evidence is not so clear as to leave no doubt, but the shades of strength in opinion can hardly be defined or exemplified, hence the use of qualifying words as a firm, full, or strong belief, end quote. Now, this is very essential to note when decoding any and all presented information that was given to you as if it is truthful, because the term persuasion has a manipulative construct that is typically not based on any logical grounds or even empirical evidence for that matter. According to the 6th edition of the book entitled Persuasion, Social Influence and Compliance Gaining, authors Robert Gass and John Cedar stated that the term persuasion is, quote, an attempt to influence a person's beliefs, attitudes, intentions, motivations, or behaviors. So if the term persuasion also carries a negative connotation when referring to the English definition of the word belief, then that should make you question if what you were taught to believe in, especially if it's not yourself, carries a malevolent side to the story that is simultaneously promoted as the greatest influence in your life, regardless if any hard evidence is present or not. So my original question can be simply answered by the process of elimination. but I am aware that some of you may have a hard time digesting information versus what you are traditionally accustomed to hearing, and that's fine. So let's take a deeper dive down the rabbit hole, shall we? Some people would state that the term Moor was another word for black, and it refers to black people or African people. But here's the problem with that. There is absolutely no hard evidence that exists today that would support this heavily campaigned theory. In fact, the term Moor was vaguely used historically, and when it was done so in a descriptive sense, referring to a person predominantly of the Muslim faith or even Christian faith later on that has a dark hue of complexion and resides throughout the surrounding lands nearest the Mediterranean Sea and so forth. What is very important to note here is that dark does not necessarily mean that a person's skin complexion is literally black in color. It simply describes a person's hue as being different shades in color, which is realistically various shades of the color brown. The term Moor does not refer to just one common racial group of people of a particular country or continent, or even one particular culture for that matter. The origin of the word Moor, with having only this form of spelling, can be traced back to one of the many lingua francas that still exist today. In my previous documentary called What Language Was Used Before English Existed, I mentioned that a lingua franca takes many words and their meanings or ideas and reduces them into a simplified version that could be understood by many. Lingua franca literally means Frankish tongue, a language that is commonly spoken in Germany that eventually evolved into what is known now as Dutch. For example, this is why you would normally discover that many of the Amsterdam artists, in which the people of Amsterdam of the Netherlands speak Dutch, depicting various historic paintings of Muslims and or Muslims of various skin complexions, and even the indigenous people of the Americas, in labeling them with included descriptions that read the Moor, or American Moor, or even Blackamoor, due to their Frankish tongue or lingua franca that literally reduced many other native languages used throughout the surrounding areas during the trade era into their now more simplified primary language. This means that just because a foreign stranger gives their best reasoning behind their portraits or paintings' descriptive labeling does not mean that the person or people that are displayed in the picture called themselves what the artist made mention of, because it was merely based on the artist's perception. It is very difficult to verify what the term Moor was historically meant to describe. This is why there are many authors, researchers, and historians alike who struggle with pinpointing a conclusion that they would all agree upon when it comes to the history of this term, especially due to its vague usage. For example, according to the 1828 Webster's English Language Dictionary, a Moor is, quote, a native of the northern coast of Africa, called by the Romans from the color of the people, Mauritania, the country of dark-complexioned people. This same country is now called Morocco, Tunis, Algiers, etc. End quote. Then what's even more vague is the etymology of the term Moor, which is, quote, North African, Berber, one of the race dwelling in Barbary, inhabitant of Mauritania, Roman Northwest Africa, a region now corresponding to northern Algeria and Morocco, also applied to the Arabic conquerors of Spain, being a dark people in relation to Europeans. Their name in the Middle Ages was a synonym for Negro. Being the nearest Muslims to Western Europe, it was used indiscriminately of Muslims, Persians, Arabs, etc., but especially those in India. End quote. Now keep in mind that these people who resides in the areas that I just mentioned do not call themselves Moors. Also, they do not all speak one particular language, nor do they have the same cultures, history, or even dialects, nor do they refer to their continent as Africa, unless they are not speaking their native languages, in which this should all ring a bell here. A Lebanese college professor who was born and raised in Shimlin, Lebanon in 1886, and then migrated to America during the year of 1913 by the name of Philip Curry Hiddie, wrote a book entitled History of the Arabs that was initially published in 1937, stating, quote, the Romans called Western Africa Mauritania and its inhabitants Mori, presumably of Phoenician origin, meaning Western, whence the Spanish Moro and the English Moor. The Berbers, therefore, were the Moors proper, but the term was conventionally applied to all Muslims of the Spain and northwestern Africa. The 500,000 Muslims of the Philippines are still known by the name of Moros, given them by the Spaniards on the discovery of the islands by Magellan in 1521. End quote. So, if a person chose to subscribe to this author's narrative and extensive research as being truthful, then that means that the Romans referred to the so-called Moors as Mori, which has a historic Phoenician origin that means Western, which does not describe a people by their skin complexion nor their religious choice, but merely by their geographical location. Interesting enough. Which should make you ask some questions. Like, with this author, Philip Hiddie, being born in the ancient Phoenician city of what is now known as Lebanon, would he really know the truth? And if so, does that mean that the Phoenicians are in fact the people that will be called Moors by some of you today? And if you didn't already notice, there is no pre-existing records or documentation that indicates some form of a great migrational period of any of these people inhabiting the areas that I just mentioned, immigrating to anywhere throughout the lands now commonly known as America. And with all due respect to the people that still resides in those places today that I mentioned previously, forgive my people, for they did not know how deceitful the indoctrination process of their true identities stretches far beyond their assumptions and misinterpretations that their minds could even imagine, especially throughout today's society in America.
OCO beautiful people, I hope you're doing fantastic. My wife and I released these 4 books that you see on the screen. If you would like to order your copy, you may do so at our website at DaneMakeYouThink.com. Again, that is DaneMakeYouThink.com. We appreciate all of your love and support. Wado.
We are punished today because we helped free slaves. Okay? If my tribe never helped to free slaves, they may never would have bothered us. We may never would have bothered us. We may never would have bothered us. We may never would have bothered us. If we would have just continued helping Europeans as they came in, we were fine.
Mr. Roach, how did you happen to come to this place?
Well, I came to Augusta, and I was talking to some people, and they told me to came on down to Waycross, that there was a lot more work around Waycross, see?
Well, how many miles have you been traveling looking for work so far?
About 1,600 and something.
Mr. Roach, where did you spend the night last night with your family?
Over in the woods. Put up on the side of the road, a little dirt road and slept in the woods, outside the car.
If we would have just continued helping Europeans as they came in, we were fine. But when we decided to help the slaves,
let's try woman.
Okay, where they say, oh, we came from Africa over here. No, a lot of us was already here.
African Americans built this nation. We built this nation. You know, you're just starting to get real credit for that. Okay, I don't know if you know that. You're just starting to get, you built the nation. We all built it, but you were such a massive part of it. Bigger than you were given credit for. Does that make sense? Right?
Well, we was already here in America's truth. A lot of people say, well, we are African. Don't make a mistake about that. Only way you're going to find out, everybody that's black ain't no African, everybody that's black ain't no Native American neither. Only way you're going to find out, you go back and find out who you look into your own family. This is what they don't tell you. You got to look into your own family and see who your family member is.
I'm a need. That's a job. We need to say this land. If we know who we are.
Throughout today's society of America, the process of education is based solely on the credence to that which is most popular by public opinion. rather than which would be truthful by way of logical and critical thinking. Compulsory school curriculums in history, for example, derives from fabricated folk tales that were authorized by manipulative social engineers of the 19th century, and their opinions alone are somehow credible and are unmolestedly deemed as historical facts without being constructively criticized or even publicly challenged for validation and accuracy. It's as if people now concluded that if something can be believed by the masses, then they should just tag along and follow the crowd and believe it too. But how did we, as a people, allow our history to be written solely on the basis of a stranger's opinion or by popular belief? Why would these strangers have a right, or even the knowledge for that matter, to tell the stories of our actual history here in America, when the truth is, those strangers were not living here with our indigenous ancestors to bear witness to any account to begin with? Now, I want you all to think about the very first time that you have ever heard of the term slavery, and try to recall what you were told about the so-called slave ships amongst these slave stories. Many of you can recall hearing information given to you concerning the slave ships themselves, deriving from third-party sources, and maybe not your school initially. But that's very important to note, because we must now ask, where did these third-party sources retrieve their information about the slave ships in general? These third parties are things like books and movies and even the media that tends to give their cultivated possible descriptions of these so-called slave ships based merely on their perception of what they consider to be a fact, based on information taught by a stranger, or rather by someone else's opinion. For example, fictional movies like 12 Years a Slave and Armistead, then the resurfacing of the story surrounding Clotilda, which was allegedly found and deemed as the last American slave ship, just like the Wanderer, which was also deemed as the last American slave ship. But yet, there are no viable remains of either ship or boat, just a story, in order to keep the idealism of slavery afloat. What all of these third-party sources have in common is that their stories tends to lead to a dead end when researching any publicly verifiable evidence to validate their claims made, along with validating their depictions of what a slave ship actually is. So, what's a depiction? A depiction is an old French word that is defined as a portrayal in picture or a representation in words, a portrait. What is also very important to note here is that by creating a portrait or a portrayal of a depiction, it does not have to be accurate. It is just meant to show a generalized likeness or an idea of something by way of imagination that is agreed upon. According to an 18th century painter and the founder of the Society of Arts, Sir Joshua Reynolds stated that, quote, "In portraits, the grace, and we may add, the likeness consists more in the general air than in the exactitude of every feature." So, what does all of this have to do with the existence of slave ships? Well, that's the point. There were no official slave ships, nor were there any ships created for the intended purpose to carry only slaves. These depictions that were mysteriously given to us about these ships manipulated the mind into believing that there were actual slave ships that existed, when in reality, there is no hard evidence to support this heavily campaigned theory. In fact, you will not find any colonial documentation that would use the term slave ship to describe their passenger ships, cargo ships, merchant vessels, or warships. This means that these stories of slave ships are contradicting themselves, because these ships were actually wooden sailboats that did not include utilitarian motors as a convenience. These motorless sailboats were originally known as rowboats that were called skiffs, dories, and wherries that were chiefly propelled by the use of sails and oars for navigating the boat even through tumultuous seas, violent winds, and unexpected climate changes. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, these rowboats were used for many things, like trading goods, or for the transportation of goods, exploration, pirateering, and of course, immigration. But just not those stories of immigration that most of you are accustomed to hearing about. And here's what I mean by that. Just imagine a school of people cramming themselves onto a boat today, trying drastically to avoid what's known as immigration laws, packing themselves in the trunks of vehicles, and even small cave-like holes underneath the ground, doing whatever it takes to travel to America, due to their belief that America is the land of plenty, with new beginnings for themselves and their families, opportunities for employment and affordable housing, all while risking their lives in hopes of gaining freedom. This should all ring a bell here and make you wonder if people were willing or unwilling to aboard these rowboats or cargo passenger ships in the first place. Or maybe the question should be, were people forced into slavery, or was slavery simply done by choice? Now, before I go any further, I want you to note again that during the 1600s and until the near end of the 1800s, rowboats or cargo ships were not modernized to include engines or motors that would conveniently drive the boat throughout the seas. The commercial production of steamboats or riverboats were made available at the tail end of the 1800s as well, which should make you wonder, how many so-called slave ships were accounted for that enabled strangers to carry a whopping 12.5 million people, along with supplies, food, and other cargo from one continent to another? And if there were no motors or engines attached to these slave ships, then some company or fictionalized character would have been created and placed up for public display by now in order to showcase how an impossible task of dragging millions of people out of their native lands and forcing them to work on some distant land is somehow a reality, and it actually happened. But I guess since slavery was so bad that it's no need to prove that these slave ships actually existed, right? Now, let's take things a step further. As you may know, this type of travel was extremely perilous during the time periods prior to any advanced technologies, allowing for more pernicious routes to be taken. Merchants or sailors traveling across the Atlantic using sailboats had no choice but to take specific routes based on the Volta do Mar Largo, which is a Portuguese phrase meaning turn of the wide sea. This Volta do Mar Largo phrase refers to the oceanic rotation that
I will be back on this live. Gotta take care of some business.